Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. Today I'm speaking with American writer Danielle Dreilinger. Danielle is a graduate of Columbia University and has been a journalist for over 20 years, a career which has taken her from Boston to New Orleans, and she now lives and works in the state of North Carolina. She's written on topics such as education, urban affairs, children's issues, the South, inequality, and gender. She joins me today for a discussion about her 2021 book, The Secret History of Home Economics, How Trailblazing Women Harness the Power of Home and Change the Way We Live. Danielle, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm interested in starting with your background. Would you mind telling me how you got into journalism and what made you want to choose that as a field and career?
Well, I kind of did everything I could not to be a journalist because it is, as listeners may or may not know, a very difficult industry. But I wanted to write, and I wanted to write about real people. And, you know, it so turned out that there is a job to do that, and that is journalism. So, yeah, I sort of fell into it when I began my career as an arts critic, and I just found myself more and more wanting to share with readers stories about where I lived and, you know, things that they might not notice and why they mattered.
Mm-hmm. And did you grow up on the East Coast somewhere, or?
I did. I grew up in Metro New York, and I moved to Boston in the late 1990s.
Uh-huh. And so you grew up in New York, you went to university there, and you began your career in Boston. Was it a big change and a big move to go down to Louisiana and New Orleans?
You know, it's funny.
Or was it enjoyable?
It's funny you should ask that, because I just met somebody the other day for the first time who also went from Boston to New Orleans. And everybody always thinks so. It must be so different. And, you know, of course, in some ways it is. But in my case, you know, I found that they're both cities of neighborhoods, and they are both cities that have a pretty strong sense of self, ego. There's both cities with a real big ego. So, and you know, I mean, I went down to New Orleans because I had a job at the Times-Picayune, the newspaper there. So I didn't really have time even to feel culture shock, because I just immediately started learning and writing about where I was living.
That's great. It's a nice insight into and comparison into the two different cities. I've been to Boston once, but never New Orleans. And so back in 2016, is this when you began research on the book, The Secret History of Home Economics? How did this project begin, and how did you realize that there's a book to be written on this subject?
Well, so it's funny, because I suppose I backed into the book idea too. I'd been covering education in New Orleans, and I wanted to write a book. And I was applying for a fellowship, a journalism fellowship, that was going to give me the opportunity to start working on a book. And I had been a finalist for the fellowship the previous year. I wasn't excited about my original topic. I decided to change direction. And the thing is that I couldn't just write about New Orleans. Like most journalists, the books they start working on are books that they find on the beat, like while they're working as a journalist. But another author had already written the big post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans education book. So that was taken. So I really just gave myself I felt like, what sort of book do I want to write? And I thought, well, it has to be about education, because I've been covering education. It has to be an idea that's big enough to be a book. Someone can have already done it, you know, the sort of basics. I wanted it to be about race, gender, and class, because I felt like otherwise it just wouldn't be relevant. I wanted it to have to do with history, because I love reading history. Like I'm not sure I've been fully thought about, like, had that as a category. I knew I was going to write about history. And the X factor was when I had gone in for my interview for the fellowship the year before, they said, "Oh, what do you like to do in your spare time?" And I said, "Well, I cook a lot." And they said, "Oh, this fellowship's at the University of Michigan." They said, "Oh, the University of Michigan's library has this amazing culinary collection. You could, if you came here, you could use it." And I could just feel myself light up. So I thought, cooking, like there should be something about food in here. And I just put the parameters in my head and, went about my life. And within about 2-3 weeks, I thought, oh, home economics, the class that used to teach girls how to cook, right? It was all the ideas together. Now, of course, it turns out it was much more than that, but I didn't know that. So I started researching it in the fall of 2016 because I had to do enough to be able to write a proposal for the fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I learned was that one of the founders of home economics was the first woman to go to MIT. And immediately I knew that there's so much going on here that I don't know about, that nobody knows about, right? Like clearly this is not just some class for like girls who want to be wives if one of its founders was the first woman to MIT. And from there I just took off.
So that's a great segue into the next question I want to ask you about how we maybe think about home economics, or we don't have quite the right framework for thinking about it. So as you trace the history up to the present day of home economics, what framework and definition are we using to understand what it was when it developed and as it progressed to the modern day?
So that's a great question, because the movement was very interested in defining itself. And the early days, they had a bunch of definitions, all of which I think the key point is that they are much more lofty and they are much more outward facing than I think people think. So people assume that home economics is, the insulting phrase for it is stitching and stirring, like making aprons, making brownies. And even when people might have a slightly less derogatory view of it, I should say, I know you're based in Japan. I am under the impression that, it certainly remained more popular in Japan than it has in the US. But even so, it was, people like, oh, let's learn how to cook healthy food, right? Like, let's learn how to make your house nice. Those skills were part of home economics from the beginning, but they had a much bigger mission and a much bigger definition of improving home life and improving families in order to change the world. That the house had to respond to the enormous changes of the 19th century, most of all the Industrial Revolution, that changed the economic position of the home, right? People weren't, there were a dwindling, for farmers, the home is still an economically productive unit, but there's a dwindling number of those people. Mostly people are working in factories. They're not doing, they're not making candles at home, right? They're going to factories making lamp parts. And that the home had to respond to those changes and take advantage of those changes, but then also reach outward to improve lives, to improve health, to improve education, to improve career prospects. So all of the early definitions we're looking at those, both of these levels, right? Like the skills that you need to do to make a house that's healthy and promotes happiness, to improve the world and the status of women.
The first home economist that you talk about in the book is Catherine Beecher, a woman who is from Connecticut and grew up in the early 19th century. And I'm interested in hearing you talk about her contributions to home economics, what she gave to it. And also, she wrote a really important book called A Treatise on Domestic Economy, which As I understand it, there were centuries of prescriptive literature for women, but this one, there's something different about it and the impact that it had in society. So how did she, I guess, change, or what did she change about this literature?
Right. So Catherine Beecher, who is part of the famous Beecher family, Harriet Beecher Stowe is the only one most people know of now. Uh, her big contribution was twofold. And so domestic economy, this is what she called the field. The field changed names over the course of the first 70 years or so, and then again in the 90s, the 1990s. One of the big difference, there had been household tips, there had been cookbooks, right? Like home, like guidance for people at home. The big difference of Catherine Beecher was that she was an educator. So she founded and ran some of the earliest high schools, basically, for girls. Because, it's really extraordinary to think about, 1820, there weren't a lot of schools, period, in the U.S., certainly not for anybody. And almost all of them were for white males. And so she had this vision of, it wasn't about homemaking tips. She thought that housekeeping was too important to be left to parents or mothers or servants to teach, right? That it should be taught in the school along with academic subjects. So she brought this, didactic childhood education component that had not been there. Like no one had thought about formal education in these topics. And she also had this, she had a real wide ranging view of what counted as domestic economy, including architecture and what we would now call phys ed. Like she thought that girls should be, doing calisthenics and exercising to be strong, which was a pretty radical idea for, middle and upper class women, white women at the time. And she also tied it into this moral vision. So her whole family, many of them were preachers, they were abolitionists, they were religious. So she was sort of used to thinking on this elevated moral plane. And the book starts not with like, okay, here's what you need to do for your first unit in domestic economy when you're teaching it. It was about the role of women in a democracy. And she thought, this paradoxical sort of flip about, right? She was like, the place of women is in the home, but the home is more important because, women are raising the citizens of tomorrow. She brought this moral framework, this larger vision, and this educational component that had not been there at all.
She felt that it's not just about how to care for a home, but it's about the power of women to glue together a fragile society. I can't remember if that was her quote or if I'm quoting you there.
Yeah. I don't remember I don't myself remember whether I was paraphrasing or quoting, but she certainly thought, I think it's in a way, I think it's very much a like U.S. contemporary Republican view in some parts of the Republican Party of the world is falling apart, but like women can glue it together and keep democracy together.
I'm interested to know if she was having success with her schools in Hartford. Why did she leave and go to Ohio to work with her father, do you think?
It seemed like she wanted a new challenge. She also was not terribly, she sort of wore out her welcome in Connecticut, just locally. She was clearly a kind of difficult person. When she went to Ohio, her school there didn't last all that long because she and her dad, especially, she just managed to get on the wrong side of all the powerful people because they were coming from the East and that they thought that they were superior and, that they needed to teach these women in the Wild West, which, the U.S. at the time, this roughly was about 1826. Ohio was, a lot more west than
it was
is
sort
today.
of frontier at that time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So she got on the wrong side of everybody. And when she wrote the treatise on domestic economy, she had been pretty much, she annoyed the people who were paying to send their daughters to that school, and
Mm-hmm.
the school had to close. And she was staying with former students. She didn't have a house of her own. She was writing textbooks. She was writing articles. Like, she was not, economically speaking, or career-wise, like, she was in a real low point.
The next woman who I found incredibly interesting was a woman named Ellen Swallow, and later Ellen Swallow Richards. She studied at Vassar and MIT. I quite enjoyed the descriptions of her studying at Vassar, and I don't know if this is the correct way to view it, but I had this image of these sort of young boys away from home studying there and almost relying on this young, brilliant woman in ways to help them, you said, with sewing buttons or,
yeah, and that
or
was
things
at,
like that.
at MIT, not Vassar.
That was MIT,
Vassar
sorry.
was all female. But yes, well, not all the MIT students were all that young. Because this was long before MIT was in its first few years of existence. So this was before we had this model of you go to high school and then you go to college. Some of the people in these colleges, like Ellen herself, had been studying and working for a number of years before there was a college that opened up that would admit them and cover something that they wanted to study. But yeah, she sewed their buttons on for them. They were, a lot of them had not been away from home. It was a very different time. Actually, it's a shame that the one thing that somehow went askew in my book is I had written like a third of a page on her coming into the labs for the first time, because this wasn't the first biography of her about how, and the only woman there is like the janitor, basically. It was like the office manager, basically, of the place. And she said to the president of the college, like, she looks rather weak, frail to take on a course in chemistry. And he said, did you see the glow in her eyes? She will not fail. It's this very majestic scene, and somehow it got cut in editing, and by the time I noticed, it was too late to put it back in. So I'm happy to be able to share the story now, because there wasn't.
Yeah, well, I guess it leaves an interesting story to tell as you're speaking about the book later. So at least you can still have an opportunity to tell that story. So there are many things we can say about her. Let's start with, she was a brilliant woman, and what I was struck by reading about her was, in doing a graduate degree in American history, I've never heard of her before. So I'm interested in asking you, how well do Americans remember this figure from American history? And I noticed on YouTube there's a whole series of lectures dedicated to who she was and the work she did in water. Was it water cleanliness? Or
water purity, the chemistry.
There's at least 2 or 3 biographies of her. So.
There are, though the most recent is from like maybe 1935. Yeah, I mean, so I would say, as a person who certainly never did a doctorate, but read a lot of U.S. history, I had never heard of her. I don't think, like, nobody. Nobody. The only people who have remembered her, I think, are home economists. So, and that she's one of the few people from the history that is remembered within the field. And the other is people who do research in women in STEM. So people who are going back and really hunting for like foundational women scientists, as the first woman to go to MIT. And she had not home economics domestic economy at that point, this is about 1871 when she was at MIT. Domestic economy was being taught in some K-12 schools, but it was not a college major. She was a chemistry student. But yeah, no, she's pretty much forgotten.
The next figure that we'll talk about is Margaret Murray, later Margaret Murray Washington. And then after we introduce her, I'm interested in getting at some of the tensions as the field's developing. And we're moving towards the end of the 19th century. But let's also introduce Margaret Murray. And she was born in Mississippi and had an opportunity to go to Fisk in Nashville to study, and ended up getting work at the Tuskegee Institutes. And how did places like Tuskegee help African Americans in the Reconstruction period of United States?
Right. So Margaret Murray Washington, who even more forgotten than Ellen Swallow Richards, she was a product of and a creator of historically Black colleges and universities. So she was a Black woman, technically biracial, and Fisk was a Black college, as was the Tuskegee Institute, and who her later husband had co-founded. And so at the end of the Civil War, you saw in the U.S. this explosion of colleges to educate people who had not had those opportunities, and they all played a really massive role in home economics. So those would be for women, scientists, rural people like farmers, and Black people. And Tuskegee, there was from the start, and this divide certainly within HBCUs. It's really within U.S. education period, which is what's the purpose of education? Is it to create good citizens, or is it to find a job? And and of course many people would say like both, but in practice, colleges really came down on one side or the other. Fisk was most emphatically like let's create citizens and educators, right? Let's create people with a classical education. A classical education shouldn't just be for fancy white men. So they trained, you would take Latin and Greek and liberal arts. But Margaret was a teacher. She had taught her way through school in the first place, and she wanted a job, so she was putting her as she was graduating, right? She was open to teaching at any of the Black colleges and universities, and she ended up getting a job at Tuskegee, which was on the other side of the equation that felt very strongly about training Black people to have jobs. And the thing is, Booker T. Washington, had this, you shall never, hopefully I'm going to get this quote correct, like, we shall never progress as a society until we realize that there is as much honor in tilling a field as there is in writing a poem. And he too, had this broader moral and political vision of, if you create Black self-sufficiency, economically speaking, that is powerful. That's powerful politically. That's powerful for self-respect. And, but it was very controversial because some of these fields that they were working on, Tuskegee wasn't training lawyers. They were training people to work in agriculture and, similar. So, there was a lot of question of like, are you training people to be cooks and maids and laborers and these, slavery oriented jobs? So Margaret Murray Washington went as an English teacher, but within a couple of years, she had really embraced this philosophy of, and if all the students at Tuskegee also took literature and math and so on, but they had to spend about half their time basically training for a trade. And domestic science, which was what the field was starting to be called at that point, she ended up running that program because basically all of these jobs that women could get were things like milliners, dressmakers, launderers, but again, they were not, she wasn't going to be training women to be cooks. She was training women to be educators and moral leaders in their communities.
Mm-hmm. She met Booker T. Washington, and eventually those two got married. And she, in addition to the work, assumed the role of stepmother and helped raise his 3 children as well. And throughout his career, did she play a role, or what role did she play in helping him with his career as well?
Well, Booker T. Washington was super busy, and he was constantly traveling. He was constantly raising money for the Institute. He was constantly he was the best known Black educator in the country, right? So he was giving speeches and talking to people, and he had a secretary who was indispensable to him. And I went to the Tuskegee archives, and just the number of telegrams between him and Margaret, and like him and his secretary, to say basically like, "Hi, I'm coming home from Iowa Sunday 7:56 p.m. train." So she was a lot of the times holding down the fort for him at Tuskegee and in charge. And she was the dean of women. She was the dean of like women's industrial education, right? So she was running sections of the college. Though she also herself went out as an ambassador to speak about the power of the Black home. And so while her husband was talking about the economic uplift of Black farmers, she was talking about the moral uplift of their wives learning how to keep a middle-class home and raise children in this, middle-class way. And she was an ambassador for Tuskegee wherever she went, because she was, she worked hand in glove with her husband.
Right. So moving towards the end of the 19th century, we get something called the Lake Placid Convention, where the term home economics is decided upon. And I'm interested in hearing you talk about something. I'm going to do a little bit of quotation and paraphrase to get at some of the tensions within the field. So, home economists believe that improving the home could and would improve society. How best to achieve that raised attention within its purpose. Was the backbone of home economics moral, scientific, or both? Was its purpose practical or intellectual? Would it serve farms or cities? So you've started addressing this, but as the United States is becoming more industrial, cities are getting bigger. I would say it's still on balance rural, and agriculture is still a big focus in the Reconstruction period. But how do these tensions about its purpose get discussed at the Lake Placid Conference, and how do they decide on the term, the name home economics?
Well, the name home economics that's an easy answer. So the Lake Placid started with truly just a dozen people, and they held these conferences for 10 years, and they grew and grew and grew. And, fairly important to point out, these conferences did not include everybody, because, Margaret Murray Washington was the start, but a bunch of Black colleges which were like land grant colleges, were also doing domestic science. In fact, to be fair, Hampton actually predated Tuskegee on this. But the people organizing the Lake Placid Conference at the resort in Lake Placid, New York, Annie and Melville Dewey of the decimal system, they did not allow Black people or Jews at their resort. So none of the Black people were invited to this conference. It was an entirely white conference. And they came up with the name home economics because they felt like domestic science was a little, well, twofold. One is all of these different visions of what the field should be were flying around. They felt that the bulk of what was being taught was not smart enough. It wasn't intelligent enough. So it wasn't well thought through, right? So there might be immigrant kids in Toledo, Ohio, who were taking domestic science in school and they were learning fancy embroidery. And, what was the point of that? It wasn't practical. It wasn't, it was just they were doing fancy work. And there was a certain number of white women. This is a total tangent, so I will not go down it. But there was a movement among middle-class women, the club women's movement at the time. Fascinating. These women's clubs that would get together and they would do everything from charity projects to giving each other concerts to discussing foreign affairs to, they had this to doing social activism, and there were clubs for Black women and clubs for white women. And some of what the white women were doing was, it felt a little too, the people like Ellen Richards thought were too craft project-y. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So they chose and what they wanted was, they envisioned this double field that would free women from drudgery by bringing science into the home so that women could get their housework done faster and have more time for things that mattered. And, whether that was going to school or paid employment or what, that was up to you. But, they did not fetishize housekeeping. And they thought that this field could create jobs for women because all of these skills would be tied, even sometimes tangentially, to what women had traditionally done in the home. So, for instance, hotel management was a home economics job. And this was a job that, this is why, if you've ever wondered why hotel schools are sometimes in, those would be part of the School of Home Economics back in the day. So that was for that reason, the women who were gathering at Lake Placid were mostly the ones who were more interested in science and careers than moral uplift, for the most part. And they were interested, so they created the term home economics because they thought it sounded more respectable than domestic science, and it sounded much more like something that would have a place in in college. They could see it having a place in the colleges because it used the word economics, basically. And that was explicitly their goal, was to create college departments. And they went ahead and did that, did exactly that. And even so, there were definitely people, especially as the conference went on over the years, who came in with more of that moral uplift view. But, it also all sort of knitted together in a better life. Let's create better lives for people, right? Let's create lives that are healthier. Let's eliminate poverty. So, there were all of these lofty goals. And although turned out there were some of these components that were a little bit at odds, that early on, around, the start of the 1900s, I think there was so much ferment and activity going on in the field that those problems and disagreements got pushed way down the road.
Just that last 30 seconds, Danielle, I lost sound. Oh, it seems to be back. I think it won't
Okay.
be a problem because my little meter on the side, it was still registering
Okay.
your
Okay,
voice.
good.
So for whatever reason, I didn't hear it there. So I think
Okay.
we'll be good there.
Okay.
I'm interested in how innovations in efficient methods
Mm-hmm.
and in technologies were aimed at saving people time. I think time is one of the most interesting aspects of the progression of this field up to modern day, and talking about work-life balance in a 21st century context to me is it's an interesting topic at the moment. Uh, One of the things I'd like to hear you discuss is the standardization back
Mm.
at the early 20th century. How did home economists start standardizing things? And was the goal to standardize things for saving time or making things more efficient?
So, as a multi-part question, pardon me, this is Henry speaking of work-life balance.
uh,
Uh,
your cat? Yeah.
yes. So, uh, so a few things. First of all, some of the standardization came kind of adjacent to home economics,
Mm-hmm.
which was the Fanny Farmer cooking school in Boston. Fanny Farmer was well known for standardizing a bunch of measurements. Uh, and cooking schools were part of the movement, like the groups of people who created home economics. In fact, Maria Parloa, who ran the Boston Cooking School before Fanny Farmer took over, she was at the Lake Placid conferences. So some of it was, if you think about it, you are now teaching. You're teaching cooking various skills right in classrooms. You can't, like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, schools are not places where you put like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, right? Like, they are places where you learn, like, think about learning long division, right? Like, here's the method of what you need to do to make this problem work. So some of it was they were teaching these things in schools. They needed to standardize things. They needed to make sure that, you know, a measuring, like the concept of a measuring teaspoon did not exist 150 years ago. You just used a spoon that you had around.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that. Then there was the larger movement of there was a larger commercial movement. So where a lot of this standardization came in was people starting in the 1920s. You have something that became known as business home
Mm.
economics, because you had these appliance companies, with the fuller diffusion of electricity and more people in cities, right? You had people who were buying stoves that had, dials on them that had temperatures. So suddenly you needed, if you were going to tell somebody how to bake a cake, you had to say, like, oh, it's 350 degrees, or, gas mark 4 or something, instead of what they used to do, which was literally things like, put your hand in and you can hold it for 3 seconds until it's too hot. Like, that's when it's hot enough. And you had all of these companies that were marketing to housewives to buy appliances and use appliances of various sorts. And they hired home economists to market to all of these women. And as part of that, what they were starting to sell was reliability. So
Mm.
the Betty Crocker was a marketing device for gold medal flour, and gold medal flour in the 1920s promoted itself as like, these have all been tested in our test kitchens, and if you follow our directions, your cakes will turn out perfect. You will, and which is certainly saves you time, right? If you don't screw something up when you're cooking. And I think it was just generally in terms of, there was a lot home economics got really connected to the efficiency movement overall. Lillian Gilbreth, who worked in home economics for about 10 years, she is known as the mom in Cheaper by the Dozen. And she and her husband, before he died, had worked for a number of years creating efficiency in factories. So improving productivity for factory companies, and also less wear and tear on the body of the workers, right? So they would, record how people were taking glass bottles and moving them like to on an assembly line, and they analyzed it and broke it down so they could do it in fewer movements. And then Lillian designed a kitchen for the Brooklyn Borough Gas Company, right? For a utility company, because utilities sold appliances at this time, as well as the, gas or electric or oil. She designed kitchens that reduced the number of steps. And this is like our modern kitchens are based on this model. So it's less, it's again, less strain on your body to do what you need to do. It was very, and I mean, I know it's hilarious to us today, right? When we're so much more sedentary, but this was a time when people still there were still plenty of apartment buildings in cities where people had to go out back to get water, right? People were just dealing with the basics of your life was way more arduous than it is today. So it really mattered to have more efficiency in your movement and getting things done.
Yeah. Yeah. Little details, like if you have an ice box, you want it near the rear door so that the ice delivery can go straight into it. But if you have an electric refrigerator, it's better placed somewhere else within the kitchen design might be different because you have that electric stove and electric refrigerator.
Right. And look, I mean, to give a modern example, I am waiting for the delivery of a Chewy box of cat litter and cat food, and everybody who has a pet who gets home, that stuff sent to their home, these incredibly heavy boxes. And I just sit there and I'm like, man, I wish that they would leave them at the back door so I would have less of the house to drag the box across, right, than the front door where I'm going to have to pull it halfway across the house. So, similarly.
Yeah. So when I read a book called Career and Family by an economist named Claudia Goldin, and if I haven't gone back and checked this, but if I remember correctly, that she described women in the 1920s who got university educations and went on the career path. And she described these women at that time who, if they chose that, there was a much lower chance that they would also have chosen marriage and having children, because they basically had to choose one or the other.
Right.
And as this progressed to the post-war, things started to change. But what was interesting about a lot of these home economists, the subject of your book, is they too were career-driven women, and many, not all of them, did not have husbands or families. And what was an extra interesting part of this is they were working with women so that they could be stronger in their role in their families. So,
right. Yeah. So, and Claudia Goldin, who, if I'm not mistaken, recently won the Nobel Prize for her
that's right.
work in economics. And I read some of her papers when I was researching my book. So she's, I mean, first of all, yes, absolutely yes. Women, I mean, career women weren't allowed to be married and have children for a good chunk of the 20th century. So you find home economists who, the white home economists, you find many of them never married. The ones who did marry pretty much didn't have children, like Ellen Swallow Richards didn't have children. A few of them were widowed or divorced because that was accepted, right? Like, oh, now the woman is the provider, so she has to go to work to be able to support the family. But women were not married women were not the head of household. And the all sorts of business processes and rules like favored, during the Depression, companies fired women first because they said, oh, the men need to take care of, bring home the bacon for their families, and the women don't. And a lot of places would not hire married women, wouldn't hire women with kids. Classic, even teachers kind of, famously would often have to quit when they were pregnant, like as soon as they started to show, because somehow that would seem corrupting or like bad motherhood or whatever the moral strictures around it. And the exception was Black women. Black home economists often were married, not always. They often were married. They often had children. Sometimes they had stepchildren, like Margaret Murray Washington. And my analysis of that was simply that, Black women almost always had to work. Like the expectations were very different. This whole idea of, the housewife was a very white vision. It was Black men didn't get paid enough to support a family. And in fact, I write that, post-war, there was a Black women's magazine that really championed Black women finally getting to be housewives because they hadn't had the economic option. And for that matter, all sorts of white women didn't either, right? Like immigrant women, like it was a very narrow vision. But the women who had careers were already these women who were going to colleges in this, certainly as careers as home economists, were going to college, were getting teaching degrees. And it was simply not, the combined path was not sustainable. Today, it's totally different. Today, the field of home economics is, if anything, incredibly open to married moms. Possibly to a fault. Sometimes it seems like that's the norm of who works in the field. But it's very open to things like women taking a few years off to take care of their children when they're younger and then coming back. Women getting PhDs when they're 50 years old, right? And the kids are out of the house. But I do agree that it's just the most amazing dramatic irony, right? That the women who were teaching other women how to take care of the home were women who were not living in a nuclear family, who were not often doing their own housework. And I think one of the things I love about that is the whole field of home economics, but including this element, problematizes the idea that there's something natural about women cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids. Like that there's something in that second X chromosome that somehow makes you know how to do all this stuff. And it's just not true at all. Everybody has to learn how to mop a floor properly. And the fact that, the women who were in charge of this field were generally not raising children themselves, just goes to show.
I saw something a couple of weeks ago. It was an OECD report about how many minutes a day men were working in the home. And actually, lots of Western countries today, I think men are embracing this idea that they also have to be a part of the caregiving and part of the home. Places like Estonia or Australia had over 2 hours a day, I think, of where men were working in the home. And the reason I found this was in Japan, it's still quite low. Men are working about 40 minutes in the home, according to this report. And the women, interestingly, are working lots at their job and in the home here. So I thought that was more interesting than the men's side of things, which I thought would be low.
Yeah, and the U.S. stats, I mean, men are doing more work in the home, but women are still doing more than that. And if women, if they have children, if they both have jobs outside the home, like it's not proportionate, right, to like the amount of time they're working out of the home. And it just, I mean, this is an unscientific, certainly, analysis, but it just seems to me that it's easier for women to take on men's roles than for men to take on women's roles, like just writ large. So, in the US, like it's been okay for women to wear pants, trousers for decades, but it's not okay for men to wear skirts. And similarly, it seems like, okay, well, it's okay for women to have careers outside the home, but that doesn't mean that's okay for men to do more cleaning. It's still considered kind of weird for a man to stay home with the kids, right? Like women's power has gone up in that way, but like things have not fully evened out. Generally speaking, women are trained to do this stuff from very, very young, and men aren't, which is one of the reasons that, at the end of my book, I advocate for home economics classes for both boys and girls and, non-binary kids, because everybody should learn how to do all of this stuff. But it's hard. I mean, it's really hard for parents to, like with everything else they have to do, right, to like worry about teaching your son how to do the laundry without turning everything pink. But girls are just like oftentimes when straight couples have a baby, they find out that, the mom takes on more, but that's because the expectation is that like there's so much expectations about being a good mom, right? And what you're supposed to do and how all consuming is supposed to do. And we've been trained since like in subtle ways since we were tiny to notice when things are dirty, to be judged on how we keep our house. There's a fascinating therapist named Casey Davis in Texas in the US who wrote a book called How to Keep House While Drowning that goes on about like the moral virtues placed on like having a tidy house, having a clean house, having an organized house. And, and one of the things that home economists noted after World War II, when you finally had more and more labor-saving devices, yet at the same time, the standards for housekeeping for women and for parenting for women went up, right? The standards for housekeeping went up first, right? All of a sudden, you were supposed to be mopping your floor daily. That was not the case before World War II. And then when women in the 70s start entering the workforce more, the standards for parenting, for mothering, go way up. And it just, at the same time that, it should be easier. There should be more support. Like men and women should be balancing out the housework because both of them are working outside the house. And yet somehow the expectations on women ratchet up in a way, and they don't so much on men.
I thought that was one of the really interesting insights you made in the book. I wrote down a quote from it as well, that moreover, family life made the work of home never ending, an inexhaustible time suck. You can clean a floor and see that it's clean, but there is never an end to emotional labor, the cultivating warmth and togetherness of becoming a better person. And you tie that in with it was Benjamin Spock and the all of this movement of better emotionally raising your children. I thought that was a very interesting part of the book.
Thank you. Yeah. And it was especially obvious because I was finishing the book at the start of the pandemic, right? So
Mm-hmm.
all of us, all of a sudden, so much more of this work was visible, right? So much of the work of
Mm.
parenting was visible because people were suddenly, didn't have school babysitting for a good chunk of the day. And uh yeah, the and home economists, they did go through a post-war period where they were following, imposing this very patriarchal traditionalist view of the family. And they broke out of that in the 70s. And since then, they have felt very strongly about like you should have how to have like a fruitful and fulfilling family life, no matter what that family looks like, whether it's a single parent or, same-sex parents or multi-generational, like whatever that looks, if it's you and roommates, right? Like whatever that looks like, there are ways to make your family life better.
Mm.
But it's true that, I mean, sometimes everybody needs a break.
Yeah. If there's one thing that I would like to see in terms of the direction the family moves is bringing grandparents back in for a bigger role. And I saw in Hungary and Sweden, they're experimenting with paying grandparents
Hmm.
to be there and be part of raising their grandchildren. So I'm interested to see how these turn out. But I've also heard other grandparents respond to this by saying, "You don't have to pay me to do it. I want to do it." So it'd be,
Yeah, and I mean, I that's fascinating because what I think that might possibly do. So, in the US, plenty of people rely on the grandparents. I mean, geez, just an acquaintance of mine just posted on a Discord group that she and her partner and their baby are moving back to Chicago to be closer to family, which means closer to grandparents for childcare. That's what that means.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's, well, or I suppose sometimes it means your parents are getting old and you need to be the caregiver, right? But the US certainly does not fund childcare in the way that it's needed, like at all. It is a very go it's very much like a you go figure it out situation. So, people, we still rely. There was a fascinating home economics document that I write about in the book in roughly 1950. It was written for the military by a home economist who was envisioning the continuing demands of the military industrial complex as needing to employ more mothers, right? They're like, this industry will need to keep, it was the Cold War, right? So this industry is
Mhm.
going to keep going strong. This is an undertapped workforce. But how will society have to change for two parents who are both working outside of the home? And she had all sorts of ideas, including things like parent-teacher conferences being at the workplace instead of at the school. Like the teachers come to you instead of you going to the school. But a big one was daycare. Was,
Mhm.
state funded, safe, state provided daycare. And in the US, that basically, there's some resources for lower income families, but even so, it's quite difficult. So yeah, we are still relying on all of this unpaid labor for childcare. And this is this is home economics. Like this is a home economics concern because it's the same way we rely on the same for elder care, because elder care is very, very expensive. And we've just been relying on this world where like, well, the kids will take care of their parents when they get old. Well, there's more and more people in the world who don't have children.
Yeah.
So where's that unpaid workforce going to come from?
It's a really big concern here in Japan as the baby boomer generation is aging, and uh, the subsequent generations after them are getting smaller by by half each generation. So
right.
it's a concern how with debt and all kinds of things here, how the society is going to deal with becoming what's called a super aging society. Mm-hmm. As a way of bringing our conversation today to a close, I'm interested in having you talk about the cover of your book and the title and the subtitle. So there are 3 pictures I want you to describe, and maybe your level of involvement in choosing them. So the first one is this picture of this woman with a mixing bowl, milk, eggs, and butter. Is this from, say, 50, 60 years ago?
Well, so let's start by talking about the other picture, and I'll explain why.
Sure.
So that picture at the bottom is of Dr. Flemmi Kittrell. She was an extraordinary woman. She was the first Black woman to earn a doctorate in nutrition. She was the first Black woman to earn a doctorate at Cornell University. She grew up about 45 minutes north of me in North Carolina. She traveled the world. She got one of the first Fulbrights for home economics. She helped start home economics college programs in India and in various countries in Africa. She ran home economics at several universities in the U.S. And, that photo, I'm pretty sure, must have been like a promotional photo for margarine, because, she's sitting there with like these very prominent margarine boxes in front of her.
Yeah. Right down.
It's underneath my name, but I can tell you that's there. But she's here. She is, she's in a lab coat. She's a scientist. And I was given writers don't have full control over the covers or titles of their books. But I had I think the contractual term was significant input. And that obviously the publishers want the writer to be happy. And I also perfectly willing to defer to people who know what sells, right? Who know what makes a person want to pick up a book. But I felt very strongly that the cover had to not be just white women, and it had to not be school. Because this is the whole point I'm trying to make, right? It's not just the little lady in the kitchen. It's not just white kids. It's not just school. It's not, all of these stereotypes. And so I found the photo of Dr. Kittrell, and I said, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want. A Black woman scientist. Perfect. Absolutely. And so the rest of it, honestly, I don't even know what that top photo, where they got it from, where it's from at all. They said, we'd like to put this on the top. And I said, cool. All I cared about was having the picture of Dr. Kittrell.
This picture too, you and your team added color to it. It was originally a black and white photo. Yeah.
Yes, that was originally a black and white photo, and I checked with the graphic designer to make sure that it was reflecting Flemmi's actual skin tone, and she had some sort of computer official way that I don't know how she did it, but basically it was yes, this is true to life.
I liked the little details too. This part of the book is a recipe card, and I don't think it's coming through on the camera, but at first I thought there were wrinkles in the cover of my book, and I looked closer and it's just little details in the recipe card. There's a crinkle in the corner, and it looks like it's been folded down the center.
Right. And it's funny. So it sort of inspired me. So what I knew I was going to want some note cards for, writing notes to people for sending them copies and so on. And so I went on eBay and I bought some vintage recipe cards, and that's what I use to send notes to people if I'm sending them a copy of the book. I mean, it's a little tongue in cheek, right? Because, but I thought it was funny.
So the last thing I'd like to ask you to talk about is how the great title and subtitle came together, starting with it's not the history of home economics, you choose the secret history. Could you say a word about using that adjective there?
So this was my agent's idea. My agent came up with the title, and of all people, my sister wordsmithed the subtitle. The funny thing about that is she's a businesswoman and she's very quantitative.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gotten some side eye about the secret history because another book came out, or not far. There's certainly other books about the secret history, but the thing is, it really is it really is a history that wasn't known. Like, it's not like I sat there and rewrote a history that somebody did at any point. Like, I was plowing through just like literal thousands of documents and dissertations from 1940 and so on, right, to come up with, to piece together what the story was. And it really is unknown. So we knew that the title had to say home economics in it, but it also had to convey to people the fact that this is just not at all what they thought. The stereotype is not true.
Could you say a word about what made these women trailblazing?
In the subtitle, they were trailblazers. They were trailblazers in so many ways. I mean, they were the first women the first women to become tenured university professors. Like Cornell, at the time that as of the late 60s, almost all of the women faculty were in the home economics school. Like, this was where women created like a department of their own at universities. They were, to be exact, they were not the first women in the military. The first women in the military were nurses, but nutritionists, dietitians went to the war fronts in World War I and World War II to take care of soldiers and to feed soldiers and to feed sick soldiers and to feed prisoners of war. They were, they were business women. They developed the food. They developed space food. They developed, food for the space program. And so many of them were just so farsighted. Like, there were so many, like, I read an article from 1899 about how great it would be to have a teaching garden at a school, and like the kids could learn like botany and how to take care of plants, and then they could grow vegetables and they could cook them, right? So it's this vision of like farm to table, and it's in 1899. And they had this vision of equality and power for women that was very broad ranging, and they were saying this back in the 1890s. So I really do think that they were trailblazing.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed the book. I think it's as history and also the way you wrote it too. I wrote down lots of turns of phrases that I liked. Like, I think it was Lillian Gilbreth, who was the smartest woman who ever was hit behind a man, something like that. Or
smartest woman hit behind a man.
Home economics is at its best in hard times. So I liked turns of phrases throughout the book as well. So
thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Yeah, and I should mention, since you have so much of an audience in East Asia, for people who prefer to read in Chinese or Japanese, publishers in both China and Japan actually translated the book, so it's available in those languages.
Oh, great. I'll in the course that I'm going to be a part of next month, I'll tell my students about that. That's great.
Right.
Right.
Well, thank you
very
so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Great.